Hello, everybody, and welcome to Parrot Analytics Live. My name is Samuel, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Parrot Analytics. And to get started, I would like to extend a special welcome to all of our Demand 360 enterprise customers. Thank you all for making the time to be with us here today. As we wait for the room to fill up a little bit more, please write in the chat where you're joining from. I think it would be super interesting to see all of the countries represented here today. Just remember, by default, the chat is set to hosts and panelists. Make sure you set this to everyone before you send your message. So let's see if we can get a couple of comments in there, and we'll see what representation that we have here today. Despite the fact that it's probably fairly inconvenient for some of you in some of the countries you're joining from. Thank you again for making the time to be with us here today. Oh, we got some city names in there as well. Yeah, sure, put the city in. That's fine. Maybe not your home address, but the city is good. Excellent. Welcome. Quite a bit of representation from Italy. Good to see. Oh, more people from Italy. I love that. Thank you for being with us here today. Our topic today is an interactive walkthrough of our full year global TV demand report presented by our Senior Insights Analyst, Christofer Hamilton. I would say we are in for a real treat. Chris has many interesting insights and observations to share with all of us. And I really can't wait to get into today's webinar. Yeah, keep those locations coming. Just a couple of admin things before we get started. We've received all of the questions that you have already submitted. Thank you. We will address these at the end of the webinar. I'll moderate our session today. And of course, you're more than welcome to submit any questions in real time that we have as we go through the slides today. And if you like, you can once again select everyone when you submit your question. Sometimes we do get the same question asked twice, and it would be helpful if you could do that. And who knows, you might inspire others to ask an even smarter question. No, that's not what it's all about. We're all here to learn, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us today. And once we're done with the presentation, we'll answer as many of your questions as we can at the end of the session today. Chris, I'd love to now hand over to you, and we're all here to learn from you.
Cool. Thanks for kicking off, Samuel, and really appreciate everyone showing up today. It's always a treat for me to get to share some of the most interesting insights from our global TV demand report. I always see this as a chance to look back on the year and also ahead to where the industry is going. And I just want to give everyone a quick reminder of what we're going to be looking at today. So the report covers the top line global demand trends of 2022. It has a deep dive on the state of US streaming, and then specifically takes a look into demand trends for shows in 10 different markets around the world. And for today's webinar, we're going to start by looking at some high-level global trends just to set the stage. And then I picked out 3 of my favorite insights from the report to share with you in a little bit more detail. So before we get into this past year's data, I just wanted to set the stage by looking at where things were in 2021. So a few callouts here. 2021 was the first year where the share of demand for Netflix's original series globally fell below 50%. That's what we're looking at in this chart, the share of demand for streaming originals from each of these platforms globally in 2021. And another big theme of the year was that Disney Plus pulled ahead of other newish platforms. So we see it ending the year on a 7.4% share of demand. And that's comfortably ahead of other newish platforms like Apple TV Plus, HBO Max, for example, but still well behind Amazon Prime Video, which is comfortably held onto that second place behind Netflix, basically since we've been tracking this data. So fast forward to 2022, and we really see a continuation of the trends that we saw in 2021. The 2 biggest gainers year over year in percentage terms were Disney Plus, so continuing that strong growth, but also Paramount Plus. It had one of the largest percentage, percentage growth year over year. Even though it's only on a 4.2% share, it saw pretty strong growth in 2022. And that's down to it really expanding its universe of original series with the Sheridanverse, Yellowstone spinoffs, and other in-demand original series like Halo, for example. Disney Plus, its demand share was up over 30% this year. It's continuing strong growth mainly by expanding its Marvel and Star Wars universes. And we can see that compared to where we were last year, it looks like Disney Plus is threatening Amazon Prime Video's second place position much more strongly this year. So it looks well positioned to overtake Amazon Prime Video in the future in terms of its global demand share. And of course, the big point is that Netflix's share of demand for its original series dropped to an all-time new low at 41.5% for the year. So it's never been that low before, but that's really just a continuation of trends we've already been seeing. So if that was a snapshot in time, I really like this chart because you can just see how changes have been happening quarter after quarter over the last 3 years. And it really gives you a sense that there haven't been any sudden dramatic changes, but it's been a gradual shift over the last few years. And obviously the clear takeaway from this chart is that Netflix's first mover advantage in the global streaming wars has really just been eroded going back, in this chart to 2020. But I did want to highlight this year, Netflix's global share of demand for its original series stabilized in Q2 and Q3. What's going on here? I think this is due in large part to the success of Stranger Things. Obviously, that was a global hit, ended up being the most in-demand show globally for the year and in most of the markets we looked at. And another note about this show and how Netflix approached it. So Netflix was able to draw out the impact of this hit by breaking its release strategy up into 2 episode drops. So the first batch of episodes were released in May, the second in July. And that really helped the show dominate global audience attention in the whole middle part of the year. But I think that the interesting point here is that even a show that's as big as Stranger Things isn't able to reverse these long-term trends we're seeing. And in the past, maybe a single hit like this might have been able to turn the tides, even only temporarily. But we see an increasingly crowded streaming space means the impact of any one single show, even if it's Stranger Things, really struggles to move the needle on these long-term trends. Here we're highlighting Disney Plus's growing demand share over the past few years. So hit a new record demand share in Q4 of 2022. The first time it broke double digits, had a 10.2% share of demand for original series in Q4. And again, with that number, we see it's really poised to overtake Amazon's global demand share and second place to Netflix. And once again, highlighting Paramount Plus, like I mentioned, it had a really successful year, hit a new record demand share in Q2 when it was on 4.6%. And again, that's really due to expanding its Yellowstone universe and having a number of other really in-demand original series. But one strong trend we've really seen this past year is there's been consistent growth in the share of demand for original content from other streamers. We see each quarter of the past year, there's been a growing demand share for content from these platforms. So what is this? This is streaming original content from a platform that's not one of these 7 we've broken out. And these might be market-specific platforms or a niche target platform that focuses on a specific type of content, like maybe anime or horror, for example. But this means that there are more platforms in more markets putting out more original content, and that's really squeezing the share of demand from these other platforms that we've been tracking. Whereas if you look in 2021, you can see that it was a pretty stable share of demand from other platforms around the world. And the squeeze on Netflix is really coming from these newer platforms like Disney Plus, HBO Max, Apple TV Plus. This year, we see that growing demand share from other platforms has squeezed everyone else. And if that was an aggregate view of how things are going, I really like this chart because this shows to how we get to that top line demand share number with individual shows. And you can really see there are different paths to success here. You get a sense of how the different streamers are approaching their original content. So if we look at the top, that's all of Netflix's originals and where they ranked in terms of their demand in the past year globally. And we really just see them throwing all their resources at their original content, a huge number of series. And it's sort of a strategy where if you put out so many shows, you're bound to have some hits like Stranger Things or The Witcher, for example. You can see here both those series ranked in the top tier of demand for the year. But then we can contrast that with Disney Plus, for example, where we see they've got a clear cluster of shows that reach that top tier of demand. And these tend to be shows from the Marvel or Star Wars universes. We see Moon Knight coming out on top for the year from Disney Plus. And I also want to call out, if you look at Apple TV Plus and Paramount Plus, these platforms have a really good success rate. If we were to take the average demand for all of these platforms' original series for the year, Apple TV Plus and Paramount Plus would really rank towards the top of that metric. And that's really because as a ratio of all the shows they put out, a high number of their original series get into that those top two buckets of demand. So we see a number of successful series from them. And everything we looked at up until this point has been focused on streaming originals. And we tend to focus on these series because they might be some of the most high profile shows, and there tends not to be good publicly available data provided by these platforms. So we feel like we can shine a light on this, but I do want to emphasize that the full report covers all series, not just streaming originals. And if we were to look at the demand share of streaming originals compared to everything else in the year globally, they only make up about a quarter of demand. So there's really a lot more out there, and you get to see all of that in the full report. So you can compare streaming originals like Stranger Things with linear originals like Grey's Anatomy, for example, and really get an apples to apples comparison. And when we expand the scope of shows we look at like that, we can do an analysis like this. So what are we looking at here? This isn't just looking at these platforms' original series. It's looking at all shows available on these platforms in the US market in 2022. And that includes obviously original series, but it also includes any licensed shows they have, whether they're exclusive or not. And when we look at it from this perspective, we can see that Hulu's in the lead, had a 19.5% share of demand for all shows available on SVODs in the US for the year, and that came out ahead of Netflix. So these two platforms have actually been neck and neck, swapping back and forth first place throughout the years as we've been tracking this, but Hulu ended up on top for 2022. And while it might look like a clear two-way race here, I do want to highlight that bundles or mergers of platforms can really shake things up and threaten Netflix's ranking here in particular. So if you think about the fact that Disney Plus can be bundled with Hulu, that would put them together on about a 25% share of demand for all shows on these platforms, which is comfortably ahead of Netflix. And also, if you consider HBO Max, Discovery Plus, the potential to merge those two platforms and their content, that would come out just ahead of Netflix. So yeah. And I always like to highlight the most successful new series premieres of the year. So a lot of the most in-demand shows we see are returning for second, third, fourth, in the case of Stranger Things, seasons. But it's always interesting to look at the shows that were able to be successful from their first season premiere. And here we're looking at demand for new shows in the first 30 days following their release in 2022, global demand. And we see there's a clear winner. House of the Dragon really came out on top, had almost 115 times the average series demand in its first 30 days. That's well ahead of any other new series that premiered this year. And it definitely reminds me of the days of Game of Thrones when everyone was watching that. It was appointment viewing, really commanded a lot of global attention. So we're definitely seeing echoes of that in the new House of the Dragon. A few other things I want to call out here. We see 3 of the 10 most in-demand new series premieres of the year were Disney Plus originals. So we've got Moon Knight, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and She-Hulk. So a good balance across their 2 major franchises, Star Wars and Marvel. And then also 3 of the most in-demand new series premieres were from Netflix. So leading the pack, there's Wednesday in 3rd place. Cyberpunk Edgerunners, All of Us Are Dead. So if you think about Disney Plus and Netflix, both have 3 shows in the top 10 premieres of the year. But then when you stop to consider the amount of content that Netflix is putting out, that's really testament to Disney's focus on creating these blockbuster hit series. So as a share of like all the content they put out, Disney Plus has really succeeded here. And we saw that in the scatter plot, if you can remember, that just focus on highly in demand, globally popular series. And it's also worth calling out, we see a few anime series being really successful, having really successful season premieres this year. So on number 10, that's Chainsaw Man. Number 8, Cyberpunk Edge Runners. And this is an interesting show because it sort of lies at the intersection. I should say it's a Netflix original, but it lies at the intersection of two trends we've seen. Obviously, huge global demand for anime series, but it's also based on a video game, which we've seen a number of shows based on video games be really successful in the past 2 years or so. Like I mentioned, Halo from Paramount Plus, Arcane, again from Netflix, and everyone will be familiar with The Last of Us, a huge HBO series that just wrapped up and was a huge global hit. All right, so those were a few of the top line insights, but now I've picked out a few of the most interesting insights from the year featured in the report to talk through. And I do want to say that 2022 has been a year of growth at Parrot Analytics. We've really expanded our capabilities. So in these next few insights, I really wanted to showcase some of the new things that we can do. Right. So if you recall, we saw that Wednesday was the third most in-demand new series premiere globally for the year. In its first 30 days, it had 86 times the average series demand. But in this chart, we can really see how that played out over the first month or so from its release. And we see that its demand peaked on December 13th at 115 times the average series demand. What's notable about that, that's about 3 weeks after it premiered. So in contrast to other Netflix all-at-once binge release series, where we see a quick spike and then a drop-off, Wednesday was able to really grow audience attention over those first few weeks, only peaking 3 weeks in. What does that mean? That means that it was really effective at holding audience attention across those first couple of weeks. And you can contrast that with the pattern we see with some of Netflix's other binge release series, where there's a quick spike and a drop-off. And we see that this year, they've started to adjust to that by changing their release strategy. So like we saw with Stranger Things, they split it up into 2 episode drops, and that really helped the show. It helped solve for the problem of like a quick burn in audience attention. So yeah, it stayed in global audience attention for a longer period of time. And we've seen that with a few other shows like Ozark, Money Heist, and most recently You. But Wednesday didn't have that 2-part episode release. All of its episodes were dropped at once. And even though that's how it was released, it still was able to grow audience attention over the first 3 weeks. And this did remind me of Squid Game, which was the most in-demand new series premiere in 2021. It followed a really similar trajectory where it only peaked several weeks into its release. So we see both these series being really successful new premieres that gradually built audience attention over the first few weeks. But the story, I didn't want to focus on Wednesday per se, but its lead star, Jenna Ortega, and what Wednesday's success meant for her. So here we're plotting Jenna Ortega's talent demand against Wednesday's show demand. And we can really see how the premiere of this show drove a huge spike in her talent demand. This is notable because she was in a few other major projects this year. I'm thinking of the horror movies X and Scream earlier in the year, but we see that her demand, even though she was in those hugely popular projects, her demand didn't reach this new high level. It was still pretty low, and it was only when Wednesday premiered that it spiked. And we see that her demand peaked on December 4th. And on that day, she was the most in-demand actor in the world, which is a huge accomplishment for a new upcoming star like her. And also notably, her demand didn't spike and then quickly fade. It really leveled off at that new significantly higher level of tension. So this is a good example of how this show has launched it to a new tier of demand among the top actors in the world. And now this is the first new capability we've added this year that I really want to highlight. So demand is just one part of the picture when it comes to understanding the value of talent. We really need to consider sentiment to give context to how audiences feel about talent. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the share of positive conversation for Jenna Ortega in the weeks leading up to Wednesday and also following the show's premiere. So we can look at the share of positive conversation to get an idea of the percentage of audiences that are saying positive things about talent. We can also combine that with negative sentiment. So here we have the negative share of conversation. And when you combine those two things, you can end up with an overall sentiment score. So basically how audiences feel on net about a talent. What do we see with Jenna Ortega? We see that there is a pretty clear upward trajectory. That means that she was able to make audiences feel more positive about her in the lead up to Wednesday's premiere and even after it premiered. And this is impressive because a lot of times with talent, we see is they expand their fan base, bring in more audiences outside of their core dedicated fans. These people might not be as positive as their core fan base. So she was able to grow her demand hugely, like we saw, and also make audiences feel more positive about her. And the reason I love this example is because it brings together all these elements. We see TV demand with Wednesday the show, talent demand for Jenna Ortega, and also sentiment to give us that full picture of how audiences are feeling about talent. So another really exciting new capability that we've added this year is the ability to look at audience demographics. And I like to think of this as the who behind demand, and it really adds some more additional context. So I picked out one show to start with, Moon Knight. If you remember, it was the second most in-demand new series premiere of the year. And what are we looking at here? We're looking at the audience breakdown of Moon Knight's audiences. On the left, you can see what Moon Knight's audience looked like. So from a male-female breakdown, it was the audience for Moon Knight was 62% male. And it was also very young. So the largest generational group in Moon Knight's audience was Gen Z. So they made up 35.6% of the show's audience. So what does this mean? This means the show was strong. The audience of the show was strongly skewed towards young men. And we can also benchmark that against other comparable genres. So we see it compared to action, adventure, drama, and fantasy. And Moon Knight is more heavily skewed in both these dimensions than either of these genres. And as another point of comparison, I want to highlight Handmaid's Tale. So this is a new series like Moon Knight, but it did return for its 5th season in September of this year. And it's consistently been one of Hulu's most in-demand series. So what do we see with the audience of The Handmaid's Tale? We see it's strongly skewed towards women, almost a 2-to-1 female and male ratio. And its audience, the biggest generation bucket of its audience is the over 40 age group. So kind of the opposite of what we saw with Moon Knight. And I really love this chart because you see them side by side and can really get a sense of how these two shows are a bit of an inverse of each other in terms of the gender distribution and also the age. And you might be able to get a sense of what I'm building towards here. Seeing the audience demographics for any one show is interesting and valuable in its own right. But this analysis is really powerful when we expand it to look at entire slates of content. And that's what we're going to do next. Right, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at all of Disney Plus's original series, and we've plotted them on this quadrant chart. Let me walk you through how to read it. So on the vertical axis, that's the generation of these shows' audiences. So the further up a show is, the younger its audience is, the further towards the bottom it is, the older it is. And then on the horizontal axis, that's the gender makeup of these audiences. So if it's further to the right, it's a more heavily male skewed audience. And we can see a clear pattern with Disney Plus. Almost all of its shows, and definitely its biggest series, are in that upper right quadrant. So that means these shows appeal most to young men. And that's similar to what we saw with Moon Knight. So Moon Knight fits the pattern of the rest of Disney Plus's original content in terms of catering to younger male audiences. And that's really driven by its two main franchises, Marvel and Star Wars. So here I've highlighted where Disney Plus's Marvel original series fall and its Star Wars original series. And you can see a bit of, you can see how each franchise has its own demographic lean. So Star Wars is even more heavily male skewed and a bit older than Marvel is. But Disney Plus's biggest series are in these two franchises, and they're both heavily concentrated in the upper right, younger male quadrant. So changing gears, we can also look at where Hulu's original content falls. And this platform actually has a high demand show firmly in each quadrant. So it's not as skewed as we saw with Disney Plus. And it has a highly popular original series that caters to each of these four quadrant demographics. So I'll walk through those. First, we see the Orville in the lower right quadrant. So that's appealing to older male audiences. And this was originally a broadcast series on Fox, got picked up for its third season as a Hulu original. And we really see it appealing to the older male demographic. Seems that it held on to some of its audiences from its broadcast days. And this was a smart pickup for Hulu to satisfy these older male audiences where its slate of original content would otherwise be a bit weak. And in the upper right quadrant, so where Disney Plus was really strong, we see two Hulu originals that had high demand in 2022, catering to this demographic. So Solar Opposites and Animaniacs, and there's a bit of pattern there. We know that animation tends to resonate with younger male audiences. So Hulu's original series that are animated tend to satisfy that younger male demographic. And in the upper left quadrant, so these are targeting younger females, we see American Horror Stories and the Kardashians. We know that reality and horror tend to appeal to young female audiences, so they're doing the job of filling out that quadrant for Hulu. And even though Hulu has something in every quadrant to appeal to all of these demographics, we still see a high concentration of its original series in the bottom left quadrant, so that's appealing to older women, and in fact its two most in-demand shows of the year, The Handmaid's Tale and The Dropout, are firmly in this quadrant, appealing to older women audiences. So where does that leave us? We can see when we overlay these two platforms' demographic distributions that they really create a well-rounded four-quadrant service. So this would be the Disney Plus Hulu bundle. When you add them together, you get a bundled offering with something for everyone. And that's the genius of the bundling strategy. It really allows each platform to play to its own strengths, target its core demographics, while still having the potential to create a well-rounded four-quadrant service with something for everyone. Great. So the next insight we're going to be looking at is the relationship between a platform's demand and the price it charges consumers. And I really like this analysis because it draws a clear line between what platforms have to offer consumers and how much they're ultimately charging them. Right, so to begin with, we need to look at the total demand for the full catalog of all these streaming platforms. Previously, we've seen the demand share for all series available on these platforms, but I've added a movie demand here. So the purple bars are what we already saw with the demand for all shows available on these platforms. But we've added movie demand, and that gives you a full picture of demand for all content available on these platforms, series and movies. And what do we see when we add this in? We see that there's a clear three-way race in the US considering total catalog demand. Netflix is in the lead, but Hulu and HBO Max are close behind. And we can really see the strengths of each of these platforms. So we already saw how Hulu led in terms of the demand for all series available on that platform, but we can now see how HBO Max's strength is really its movie catalog. It had the largest share of demand for movies on SVODs that was on HBO Max. And even though each of these platforms has a particular strength, Netflix still in total has the largest share of demand for all content available on its platform. And worth calling out again, now that we're looking at the total picture, you can also see how bundling threatens Netflix's lead here. You can imagine adding Disney Plus to Hulu and that demand share for that combined bundle, and similar with Discovery Plus HBO Max. So that was building up to this chart. What is this? This is basically plotting that total demand for all shows and movies on a platform. That's on the vertical axis with the price per month that these platforms are charging consumers in the US. I should mention that this is for each of these platforms' ad-free tiers. Just to make it a fair comparison, because I know several of these platforms do have ad-supported tiers or even free tiers they offer consumers, but this is just a comparison of all these platforms' ad-free tiers, the demand for all content, shows and movies on them, and the monthly subscription price they pay. And the premise of the chart is so simple. The idea is that the more in-demand content platform has to offer its subscribers, the more it should be able to charge. And we actually do see a clear relationship between these two things. So you can see these points fitting this line pretty closely. And I did want to mention, if we were to just plot the number of shows and movies on a platform against the subscription price, there's a significantly weaker relationship. So this really means that demand is a key metric to understanding how much streaming services can realistically charge consumers in the market. And now this is a snapshot in time in Q4, but it's also a really useful tool for understanding future moves, whether that's price increases or new bundled offerings, or if platforms grow the total demand for content they have available. So as these things move around, we can see where these platforms fall competitively in terms of the prices they charge. And I wanted to highlight a few changes we have seen. So first, we saw HBO Max increase its ad-free tier price by $1 to $15.99 February 11th. And to give some context, HBO Max has already come under a bit of fire this past year for removing some fan favorite titles, like Infinity Train, for example. And we did a bit of an analysis on this and saw that the shows that it cut from its platform amounted to about 2% of its total series demand. So you can imagine cutting its catalog demand while at the same time increasing prices is making it look like a less attractive option for subscribers. But another way you could look at this as, if other platforms increase their prices, that fairly price line will continue to shift right. So if HBO Max is just moving now and then other platforms move along with it, it might go back to looking like a fairly priced offering for consumers. Now, I think the most interesting story in this chart is about Paramount Plus, Showtime, and their bundled option. So if you look at Showtime specifically, in the bottom left, highlighted in red, we can really get a sense of how this streaming service was overpriced relative to competition. Compared to the amount of in-demand shows and movies it had to offer subscribers, it was overpriced. And we can just even compare it to Starz, for example. So you can see that Starz offered its subscribers more in-demand shows and movies than Showtime, and it still charged a lower price. So that's not a position you want to be in. But if we were to look at Paramount Plus on its own, it actually looks like an attractively priced platform for subscribers. And we actually see that it's really similar to Peacock. Both have a very similar amount of demand for all shows and movies on their platform, and they're both priced at the same point. So those two both look competitive. So we have Paramount Plus looking really competitively priced, Showtime looking overpriced, and we see that the bundled offering of those two platforms together still looks overpriced. That's kind of Showtime's making the bundle look more costly. So it was priced at about $15 a month, and we can extrapolate from its total demand and see that a fair price would have been about $13. And I like this chart because you can really see the market adapting to competitive pressure. So just this year, Showtime was discontinued as a standalone streaming service. So that's out of the picture. Makes sense given what we've seen. At the end of last year was the most expensive streaming platform. So I guess rather than lowering its price, I figured to discontinue it. And they've offered a new Paramount Plus premium tier with Showtime. And that's been priced at $11.99 a month. So that's actually cheaper than what we saw would have been the fair price, $13 a month. So they're really aggressively pricing this at that $12 a month price point. And I think this is going to turn up the competitive pressure on these other platforms. So I think when we revisit this chart in the future, we're going to see, the competition is definitely on, thanks to Paramount's move to price this new bundled option at $12 a month. Right, so that's the end of what I've prepared for today. But I just wanted to give everyone a reminder that if you want to read the full report, see all these insights, in addition to a deep dive into all 10 markets that we cover, you can get it on our Demand 360 platform. Here are some details about what you can get with that. So I know we've penciled in some time for questions, and a number of people submitted questions ahead of time, which I really appreciate. Thank you for doing that. It's always nice to have questions come in. We can prepare a bit what we're going to say. So if you can just give me a minute to check what questions have come in through the chat, and then I'll see what we have time to answer. All right. Okay, so I think I'm going to jump into the questions that people submitted ahead of time. I've prepared some slides for those. Samuel, is that okay?
Of course.
And then I'll
Absolutely,
see if I can get
Chris.
to some of the ones that have come in while we've been presenting. And yeah, keep the questions coming, I guess. So first of all, I want to mention that a number of people asked for insights about specific markets. And every quarter we change up the markets we cover in this report. So these are the 10 countries we covered in this latest report, but we try to get a good geographic distribution of countries we're covering in these reports just to make sure everyone gets some attention. So if the market you care about wasn't addressed in this report, chances are you're going to see us cover it soon. So hold tight. But I did want to highlight India because we had a couple of people ask for insights about India. And I know that's been a popular market that people have a lot of questions on. So I pulled a few quick insights about the Indian market. What are we looking at here? We're looking at the total demand for all series in India and how that breaks down by genre in 2022. And what do we see? We see there's a high share of demand for dramas in India. So 47% of demand for the year for series was for a drama. And that's really high when you compare it to the global share of demand for this genre. So that's 39.1%. So 47% is well above that. And if India were a market in our report, it would have had the largest share of demand for dramas. And in particular, we can drill down a little further and see which subgenres are driving this. And we see crime dramas in particular, but also thrillers and romantic dramas are the three most in-demand drama subgenres in the market. So that's helping to drive that large demand share for drama. And on the flip side of that, we see that India is also has one of the lowest shares of demand for the animation and reality genres. So that's a bit of context of what shows are popular in India. I pulled the three most in-demand series in India for the year. We see Stranger Things topping the field, like it did in most markets, honestly. But it's actually a bit of a close race. So in some markets, Stranger Things was well ahead of the competition, but we see in India, Nagin and Mirzapur also had really high demand for the year. So these were the three most in-demand series for 2022. And another way you could look at this is the most in-demand shows from India in terms of their global demand. So Nagin was the most in-demand Indian series globally in 2022. I had 30.32 times the average series demand around the world. And also I want to highlight Nagin won the award at our annual Global Demand Awards for being the most in-demand series from an Asian market. So that was a really impressive achievement and a testament to the popularity of Indian content around the world. And we had a couple of people ask questions about documentaries specifically as well. So pulled a few facts on that. So top level, we're looking at global demand for documentaries and how it's changed over the last few years. We saw a huge boom in demand for documentaries in 2020. You can see that big, clear upward trend there. And then basically from 2021 through the middle of 2022, it kind of flatlined and tapered off. So most of the demand growth for documentaries came in 2020. That was sort of a pandemic theme we saw and reported on. But I will highlight that a new peak in global demand for documentaries came in September of this past year. So it seems like it might be picking up again, but we'll be watching this. And here are the 10 most in-demand documentaries globally for the year. We see Formula One Drive to Survive, sports documentary topping the list, and had a comfortable lead over all the other documentaries. So 19.2 times the average series demand. That's pretty good. We see it's consistently one of the most popular documentaries, even though it's a sports documentary, like Welcome to Wrexham in 9th place. We see that more than half of the top 10 documentaries for the year are nature or science documentaries. So there's a clear preference for that type of documentary, even though certain sports documentaries might succeed, for example. We also had someone ask about true crime, which I know has been a bit of a trend. And we see that the most the globally most in-demand true crime documentary was Indian Predator, The Butcher of Delhi. So there you go. That's the only true crime that featured in the top 10. And the final question that came through that I prepared was a question about growing demand for Turkish content around the world. And we've seen that Turkey's been one of the fastest growing markets in terms of global demand for its content outside of its home market. So I plotted that here going back to 2018. And we can see there's been growing global demand for Turkish content, but that's been driven in large part by a huge demand surge in Latin America. And we actually have a full report on this. You can find it on our website. I don't know if you have the link, Samuel, but it's a deep dive into content trends in Latin America, but specifically looking at growing demand for Turkish content in the region. And I will highlight that also in the report, I saw a number of Turkish series doing really well in the Spanish market. So it's Latin America and Spain as well. This type of content seems to be popular. So let me just look at the questions again that have come through. Let's see if I can answer any of those.
They're quite in depth, Chris, to warn you. They're quite lengthy.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So we had a question come through about the other categories. So that category we're looking at, it's kind of a catch-all for these streaming services. In terms of their global original demand, we saw there was growth there. So there are a number of platforms that fall into this category. I haven't broken out the demand shares of them, so I can't really speak to off the top of my head which are driving the most of that growth. But I did mention a few of the types of platforms. So like there are specialist platforms that focus on a niche of content. So you can think the anime platforms like Crunchyroll, Funimation, or I know Shudder focuses on horror, but then there are really like market-specific platforms, and we highlight this in the report. There are we always like to feature local origin content. So a few of these local platforms come through. So I'm sorry I wasn't able to like break that down anymore, but like that's just an idea of like what these platforms are. Will there be
Elizabeth, you're also more than welcome to write into us, and we can take a little bit of a look at that for you. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, someone asked about Crunchyroll. So like, again, I mentioned that's falling into that other bucket. They specifically asked if there would be an option to bundle Netflix and Hulu versus Crunchyroll in relation to anime content. That definitely is an analysis we could do. We could look at how, for a specific type of content like anime, we could see how a specialist like Crunchyroll compares to these more generalist streamers in that one dimension. I can't say I've looked at it yet. Okay, and then another question came through that mentioned that almost all the highest demand shows are American, but executives are looking for a local streaming content that can go global. And we do see that. So if think back to last year's breakout success of Squid Game, obviously that blew up. And here, I mean, we talked about how Turkish content is capturing audiences around the world. So we do see a lot of that. I mean, you can think of in the past, Money Heist, for example, La Casa de Papel, that was a Spanish original series, got picked up by Netflix. So it's not necessarily just American series. And you can see in the report, when you look at each of these markets, that different content from around the world is doing really well. Think of anime, for example, like that anime series tend to be some of the most in demand around the world. And those aren't American. Those come from Japan, and they've really had huge success. And we had a question come through on insights for European markets. We had a number of European markets in the report. Unfortunately, I didn't break any out in this presentation, but there's good coverage of our European markets in the report. We had the UK, Spain, Italy, France, Germany. So that's half the markets in the report. Yeah, and they each have their own trends. I can actually let me just pull some quick insights. I have the data pulled up from the report, so I can maybe just give you some quick fire insights on these markets. If you just give me a second.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here as well. And I'm seeing a lot of questions coming through, around, specific territories, specific shows, specific genres. Yes, we can answer all of those questions. And we do have the data. Just to clarify, we do have data in 100 plus markets all around the world, and we collect that on a second by second basis. So the answer is yes to all of those, but we would need a little bit of time to actually, dive in, get some insights, and then we'd have to be, then we can have a discussion about that. In the meantime, you can jump to the top of the queue and consider subscribing. The Monthly 60 Lite does give you, data updated every day in over 50 markets, and gives you access to a leaderboard for talent, movies, and TV. And so you can actually go in and answer some of those questions for yourself. And if you've got deeper, complex questions, business model questions, strategic questions, then there's obviously our enterprise partnerships that are available as well. Back to you, Chris.
Great. Can I do a rapid fire on the European markets now?
You can do whatever you want.
I pulled up
go
like a
rapid
top line
fire.
insight for each of these markets. So it's going to be fast, but we're going to have something for each of these 5 markets. So, okay. Bear with me. Germany, we saw that competition realities did really well in Germany. And in particular, there were local series that were doing well in this market. So that kind of addresses the question. We had about American series doing really well. So we saw The Voice of Germany, Germany's Next Top Model, helping to drive high demand for competition reality in Germany. Spain, so a thing that made Spain unique in the report was it had really high demand for HBO content. And there were a number of local HBO series in the Spanish market that helped boost that platform's demand for its original content. France had the largest share of demand for animated series in the market, so that's impressive. So in particular, anime is really popular in France. We've seen that before. We did a whole deep dive report on global anime trends, and France was consistently one of the biggest markets for anime. The UK. The UK was really interesting because when you look at the breakdown of where the demand for shows in the UK is coming from, at the top, in terms of their original platform, at the top is the BBC with the largest share. So obviously the BBC is a big player globally, but in its home market had a huge demand share, and then it was followed in second place by ITV. So those two together had almost a 25% share of demand for their original shows in the market, which is really impressive. In a lot of these markets, we see a single player really rising to the top in terms of a large share of demand for its original content. In the UK, we see 2. And then finally, we have Italy. And Italy had the largest share of demand and support for action adventure content. 8.1% of demand for all series was for a show in this genre. So they like the superhero series, they like action adventure in the Italian market. Okay, that was my rapid fire, Samuel. I think we're coming up on time. Is that?
Yeah, we are.
I
think we're just about there. I just noted a couple of more questions that have come in. But
did we get some more questions? Let me.
Yeah, just one now from Colin. What genres are in the lead in the UK? There's obviously lots of there's a couple of others there, but I think you've actually answered most of those. So if you've got any specifics on genres in the lead for the UK, maybe we'll grab that one and then wrap it up.
The UK was the most comedy-loving market in this report. 16% of demand for all shows in the UK was for a comedy. So yeah, we see comedies really succeeding in the UK. And then also it was the most documentary-loving market. So we see a number of big documentaries from the BBC, for example, but just documentaries in general are really popular in the UK. So those 2 genres really popular in that market.
There you go, everyone. We've put Chris through his paces.
There we go.
Both prepared remarks and also in real time. I really appreciate all of the insightful questions we've got from everyone today. Just been a pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you, Chris. Really informative, insightful session. Yeah.
It's fun for me too.
Oh, good. And look, if you've got any further questions, we'd be happy to take those. The easiest way to do that is to reply to the email that we will send out in the next 24 hours with the webinar recording and the presentation. And thank you again also to all of you for being here today. Just a quick shout out there to one of our analysts. Daniel has jumped in, who has answered one of the questions there. So Sarah, take a note of that answer before we close the session. Hopefully that's helpful to you. Thanks, Daniel. Love it.
Teamwork, Daniel.
Love it. Teamwork all around. Thank you all and make sure you take advantage of that Demand 360 Lite webinar offer. That's 30% off just for turning up today. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you at the next Parrot Analytics Live. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.